The sun had just begun its descent beyond the horizon, casting a golden hue across the vast, empty highways of the American Midwest. The road stretched out endlessly, flanked by fields of corn that swayed gently in the evening breeze. For many, this would be the ideal time to relax, but for truckers like Big Rick Thompson, it was just the beginning of another long haul. Rick had been driving for over 20 years, and he had seen it all: terrifying storms, dangerous roads, and the occasional shady character. But tonight felt different. There was an unusual stillness in the air, and the vast emptiness of the road seemed to weigh heavier than usual. Rick chalked it up to fatigue, a side effect of too many hours behind the wheel. He flipped on his radio, hoping to drown out the quiet, but the static only added to his unease. Rick's cargo was a standard load of electronics bound for a warehouse in Denver. It was a straightforward trip, but he had chosen to take a less traveled route to avoid highway traffic. The road he had selected was known for its isolation, perfect for a trucker seeking a peaceful drive, but tonight it felt eerily desolate. As night fell, the darkness seemed to envelop the road like a thick blanket. Rick's headlights pierced the blackness, illuminating the occasional road sign and the reflective markers that lined the highway. He was lost in thought, occasionally glancing at the GPS to ensure he was still on track. The monotony of the drive was suddenly interrupted by a flickering light in the distance. Curious, Rick slowed down. As he approached, he saw that the light was coming from a small, dilapidated diner on the side of the road. Its neon sign, half burnt out, struggled to spell out "open." He considered stopping for a quick break, but thought better of it. The place looked abandoned, and he preferred to keep moving. Just as he was about to accelerate, a shadowy figure emerged from behind the diner. Rick squinted through the windshield, trying to make out who it was. The figure seemed to be waving frantically, and before Rick could process what was happening, a small, beat-up pickup truck swerved into the road, blocking his path. Rick slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just inches from the truck. His heart raced as he watched the figure approach his cab. The man was dressed in ragged clothes, his face partially hidden by a grimy baseball cap. He knocked on Rick's window, his expression a mixture of desperation and malice. Rick rolled down the window slightly, keeping his hand near the door lock. "What's going on?" "You need help?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's voice was low and urgent. "I need to borrow your phone. My truck's broke down, and I've got a kid with me. We're stranded." Rick's instincts told him something was off. "I don't have a phone on me." "Maybe you should call for help from the diner," he suggested, nodding towards the dimly lit establishment. The man's eyes narrowed. "I don't have time for that. Please just let me in." Before Rick could respond, a loud banging noise came from the back of his truck. He turned his head just in time to see another figure, this one larger and more menacing, appearing from behind his trailer. The man was holding a crowbar, and he was clearly intent on causing trouble. Panic surged through Rick. He slammed the window shut and shifted into gear, narrowly avoiding the man with the crowbar who had started smashing the trailer's lock. He gunned the engine and maneuvered his truck around the small pickup, driving off as fast as he could. The men chased him for a short distance, but Rick's larger and faster rig soon left them behind. His hands trembled on the wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Rick decided to pull over at the next rest area to collect his thoughts and check the damage. He needed to ensure the trailer was secure and that he wasn't followed. As he inspected his rig, he noticed that the back lock was indeed damaged, but thankfully, the cargo remained intact. Rick's nerves were on edge as he continued down the road. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning for any signs of the men or their truck. Hours passed, and the unease never left him. The road seemed even lonelier in the dead of night, and every shadow played tricks on his tired eyes. At a particularly desolate stretch of highway, Rick saw headlights approaching in the distance. He slowed down, preparing for a possible confrontation. The truck that emerged was a semi, similar to his own, but with a trailer that bore no markings. It passed by him slowly, and Rick's tension mounted as he realized it had slowed down to match his speed. The semi's driver made no attempt to overtake him. Instead, it stayed alongside Rick as if shadowing him. Rick felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had to do something. He decided to take a chance and swerved off onto a dirt road, hoping to lose the tail. The semi followed, its massive engine growling menacingly as it trailed behind. Rick navigated the rough terrain as best he could, trying to evade the pursuing truck. The road was winding and treacherous, but he had to keep moving. After what felt like an eternity, Rick managed to find a small, abandoned farmhouse on the edge of the dirt road. He skidded to a stop and shut off his engine, hoping to hide from his pursuers. He waited in silence, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he listened for any sign of the other truck. Minutes stretched into hours, and finally the sounds of the pursuing semi faded away. Rick waited a bit longer, ensuring the coast was clear before he cautiously made his way back to the highway. He drove the rest of the journey with heightened vigilance, determined to reach his destination without further incident. By the time he arrived at the warehouse in Denver, dawn was breaking. Exhausted but relieved, Rick unloaded his cargo and reported the incident to the authorities. The police conducted an investigation, but no trace of the men or their truck was found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Rick knew he had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. The experience left him shaken, but it also made him more aware of the risks of the open road. He learned to trust his instincts and be cautious of the unexpected, knowing that sometimes the biggest threats come from the most unlikely places. As he drove away from the warehouse, Rick took one last look at the endless road ahead. It was still a long haul, but he felt a renewed sense of resilience and vigilance. The road had tested him, but he had survived, and that was a victory in itself. Anton was no stranger to the open road. A trucker by trade, he had spent the better part of his life navigating the vast, lonely highways that crisscrossed the country. The hum of the engine and the endless stretch of asphalt had become his closest companions over the years. But despite his experience, there was one route he avoided at all costs, a desolate stretch of road known as Route 66. Route 66, once a bustling artery of American travel, had long since fallen into disrepair. It was a road of shadows where the streetlights flickered and died, and the asphalt was cracked and uneven. The few truckers who dared to take it spoke in hushed tones of eerie occurrences, ghostly figures, mysterious breakdowns, and an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to the air like a shroud. But Anton, like many others, dismissed these stories as nothing more than campfire tales, exaggerated over time by bored drivers. That is, until the night he found himself with no other option but to take the infamous route. It was a crisp autumn evening, and Anton had just completed a long haul from Chicago to Los Angeles. He was eager to get home, where a warm bed and a weekend off awaited him. But as he reached the outskirts of the city, his dispatcher called with an urgent request. One final delivery, a shipment of auto parts to a small town in New Mexico. The catch: the quickest route was straight through Route 66. Anton hesitated. He had heard the rumors, but time was money, and the detour would cost him precious hours. So, with a resigned sigh, he agreed to take the load, convincing himself that the stories were just that, stories. As he merged onto Route 66, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the landscape in a deep, foreboding twilight. The road was eerily quiet, with not a single car in sight. Anton turned on the radio, hoping for some music to break the silence, but all he got was static. Annoyed, he switched it off and focused on the road ahead. The miles ticked by slowly, and Anton couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The darkness seemed thicker here, almost tangible, and the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. He rolled down the window, hoping the cool air would clear his head, but instead, he was met with a foul stench like rotting meat. He quickly rolled the window back up, his heart beginning to race. About an hour into his journey, the first strange occurrence happened. Anton noticed a figure standing on the side of the road, a hitchhiker, dressed in old, tattered clothes, with his thumb outstretched. As Anton approached, the figure slowly turned to face him, and Anton felt a chill run down his spine. The man's face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Instinctively, Anton sped up, wanting to put as much distance as possible between himself and the eerie figure. But as he passed, he glanced in his rearview mirror, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The hitchhiker was gone, vanished. Anton's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It was impossible. There was nowhere for the men to go. The road was bordered by thick woods on both sides. Trying to shake off the unease, Anton pressed on, but the sense of dread only grew stronger, seeping into his bones like ice. The road seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, the headlights barely cutting through the inky darkness. And then, without warning, the engine began to sputter. Anton cursed under his breath as the truck slowed to a crawl, then came to a complete stop. He tried to restart the engine, but it was dead. The dashboard lights flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no idea what was wrong with the truck. He grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the cold night air. The smell hit him again, stronger this time, making his stomach churn. He opened the hood and shone the flashlight on the engine, but everything looked fine. There was no reason for the truck to have broken down. That's when he heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. Anton froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just the empty road and the dense woods beyond. Suddenly, the whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was no longer a whisper but a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. Anton backed away from the truck, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voices seemed to be coming from all around him, surrounding him, closing in. And then he saw them, figures emerging from the woods, pale and ghostly, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They moved slowly, deliberately, their footsteps silent on the cracked asphalt. Anton stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He turned to run, but they were everywhere, blocking his path, closing in on him. He was trapped. Anton's mind raced as he tried to find a way out. The figures were getting closer, their whispers turning into low, guttural growls. He knew he couldn't outrun them, but he had to try. He turned and sprinted down the road, his boots slapping against the pavement, his breath ragged in his throat. The figures followed, gliding over the ground like shadows, their faces expressionless, their eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. Anton's lungs burned as he ran, but no matter how fast he went, they were always right behind him, always just out of reach. In the distance, he saw a faint light, a flicker of hope in the darkness. It was a small, dilapidated gas station, its neon sign buzzing weakly. Anton pushed himself harder, his legs screaming in protest. If he could just make it there, maybe he could find help or at least a place to hide. But as he got closer, his heart sank. The gas station was abandoned, its windows shattered, its doors hanging off their hinges. The light was coming from a single flickering bulb above the door, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. Anton didn't have a choice. He stumbled into the gas station, slamming the door behind him. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside. Dust-covered shelves, empty coolers, and a counter littered with old, faded magazines. The air was thick with the smell of decay. He moved to the back of the store, his eyes darting around for something, anything that could help him. But there was nothing. The whispers outside grew louder, more frantic, and Anton could hear the shuffling footsteps of the figures as they closed in on the building. He was out of time. With a sinking feeling of despair, Anton realized that he had nowhere left to run. The door rattled as the figures began to pound on it, their growls growing louder, more menacing. Anton backed into a corner, his hands trembling as he held the flashlight up like a weapon. The door burst open and the figures flooded in, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They moved toward him slowly, deliberately, as if savoring his fear. Anton pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. And then, just as the first figure reached out for him, everything went black. Anton awoke to the sound of his own breathing, harsh and ragged in the silence. He was lying on the cold, hard floor of the gas station, his flashlight still clutched in his hand. But the figures were gone. The whispers, the growls, the glowing eyes, everything had vanished as if it had never been there. Slowly, painfully, Anton pushed himself to his feet. His body ached, and his mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. He staggered to the door and looked outside. The road was empty, the woods silent. The only sign that anything had happened was his truck, still sitting in the middle of the road, its headlights flickering weakly. He didn't know how much time had passed, but the first light of dawn was beginning to break over the horizon. With trembling hands, he walked back to his truck and tried the engine. To his amazement, it started on the first try. Anton didn't waste any time. He pulled back onto the road, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't dare look back, didn't dare question what had happened. All he knew was that he had to get off this cursed road as quickly as possible. As he drove, the sun slowly rose, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. The fear that had gripped him so tightly began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He just wanted to get home, to leave this nightmare behind. But as he merged onto the interstate, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, lurking just out of sight. He glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at him. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the morning sun. Anton never spoke of what happened that night. He finished the delivery, returned home, and took a long, much-needed break. But he never drove Route 66 again. The stories he had once dismissed so easily now held a new, terrifying significance. And though he tried to forget, the memory of that night, of the whispers and the shadows, lingered in his mind like a dark stain. In the end, Anton learned that some roads are best left untraveled, and some stories are better left untold.